trapped in iron jaws, bleeding into the pine needles. She would have died out there, and the cowboy who found her would never be the same again. Her name was Doli, his was Eli Brandt. They came from different worlds, different languages, different kinds of grief, and what began with a rusted trap and a loaded rifle would become a story neither of them could have imagined. In the autumn of 1883, deep in the foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains of the Arizona Territory, a young Apache woman lay alone and dying, and a lone rancher with a broken heart was the only soul within miles who could reach her. Watch till the end. You won't want to miss how this one ends. And if you enjoy stories like this one, please like this video and subscribe. It helps more than you know. The cold came early that year into the high pine country east of the Sulphur Springs Valley. October still wore the bruised colors of late summer on its hills, but the nights had turned sharp, dropping below freezing before the stars were even out. Eli Brandt felt it in his hands every morning when he rose to feed the horses, that particular bite in the air that told a man the season was changing and that he'd be spending another winter alone. He was 31 years old. He looked older. He'd come to this country 4 years prior, after the range feud that took his younger brother Thomas's life in a stretch of chaparral outside Wilcox. That feud wasn't Eli's making. Thomas had borrowed money from the wrong man, staked it on cattle, and when the cattle died of fever, the wrong man had sent people to collect. Eli had buried Thomas on a Tuesday morning in the Cochise County hardpan and ridden west into the mountains, looking for land that wasn't spoken for and silence that had some room in it. Before Thomas, he'd been the kind of man who made plans. He had intended to build something larger than himself, a proper ranch, horses bred to a specific standard, maybe a family. Those intentions had a particular shape in his mind, the way a house has a shape before the walls go up. Losing Thomas had not removed the shape exactly, but it had taken the weight out of it. The plans were still there, floating somewhere behind his eyes. He just couldn't find a reason to start on them. He found the land. 160 acres of mixed pine and grassland under a long mesa, good spring water, a cabin that had belonged to a trapper who'd had the sense to build it out of timber instead of adobe. He filed on it, fixed the roof, strung the fence, and started building something small and quiet in his own. He was good with horses, careful with money, decent with a rifle. He kept to himself not out of meanness, but because most of what mattered to him had already been buried in the ground, and he hadn't figured out yet what was supposed to fill the space that left behind. Some weeks he spoke to no one but the horses. He cooked plain food without caring much how it tasted. He kept the cabin clean because his mother had kept a clean house and some habits you didn't shake, but he had not replaced the curtain she would have put on the window or the rug she would have put near the door. He ate at one end of a table made for two. His nearest neighbor was 11 miles south, a weathered man named Calhoun who ran a few head of cattle and a trading post that stocked flour, ammunition, and not much else. They spoke when their paths crossed. They didn't call on each other. Eli trapped some in the early winter months, marten, some fox, occasional beaver near the creek draws, and sold the pelts to Calhoun's post for extra cash to carry him through the lean months. He was careful with his traps. He set them deep in the timber where cattle didn't wander, marked every set on a hand-drawn map he kept folded in his vest pocket, and checked them every 2 days so nothing suffered longer than it had to. He did not know about the other traps. He'd seen their signs for about a week. Horses moving through the upper timber at night, a fire ring left in a meadow to the north of his fence line that he hadn't built. He'd found 3 iron leg holds set in the deer runs above his property, bigger and heavier than anything he owned, and he'd pulled them out of the ground and left them stacked against a pine where whoever set them would find them gone. He didn't think much more about it. Poachers came through this country every season. He didn't know they were hunting something else. On the morning of October the 14th, Eli rode up into the timber above the mesa to check his own sets, coming back around through the upper pine draws the way he always did. The sky was pale gray, clouds low, and the pine smelled of cold resin and wet bark. He heard it before he saw it. A sound like nothing in the natural world, a sharp metallic crack, and then something hitting the ground hard, and then a low cry that was quickly bitten off. Not a deer, not a wolf. Something that caught itself and went quiet out of will. He pushed his horse through the trees toward the sound, and what he found stopped him cold. She lay on her side in the pine duff about 40 yards off the trail. Young, early 20s, Apache, from her dress and her braids and the way she'd been moving through this country. Buckskin leggings, a calico blouse under a blanket wrap, moccasins soft-soled for quiet travel. One leg was caught in an iron trap, a heavy one, its serrated jaws locked around her ankle. She'd come down hard when it snapped. Her palms were torn open from catching herself, and she was looking at him over the distance with eyes that were not frightened. Exactly, they were measuring. She didn't make another sound. She looked at the rifle across his saddle and looked at him, and he could see her reading his face the way a person reads the weather. Eli pulled his horse up and raised one hand, palm out, empty. He said in English, "I'm not going to hurt you." She said nothing. Her jaw was tight. Whatever that trap had done to her ankle was considerable, and she was holding herself very still, the way an animal holds still when it knows any movement will make things worse. He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements easy, and he kept his eyes on hers the whole time, not on the trap, so she'd understand what he was doing was for her benefit. He let the reins drop. His horse was ground-trained and wouldn't bolt, and he walked toward her with both hands open. She put her hand on a stone near her head. She would have thrown it. He stopped 6 feet away and crouched down to her level. "That's a bounty trap," he said, though he wasn't sure she spoke English. "Someone said it, not me." He pointed to the trap and then held up both palms again. "I'm going to open it. It's going to hurt, I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took her hand off the stone. The trap had a heavy spring on each side. He got his knee down into the pine needles, got both hands around the spring levers, and he pressed. His arms shook with the effort. The jaws came apart maybe 2 inches, and then the spring fought back, and for a moment he thought he wasn't going to have the strength. He set his teeth and pushed, and they came apart a full 4 inches, and she pulled her foot free with a sharp, controlled breath. That was the only sound she made. When she tried to put weight on it, she went sideways. He caught her. She pulled away hard, and he let her, stepping back. She looked at her ankle. She looked at him. She was pale under her copper complexion, and he could see the cost of what she was holding back, the effort of not letting any of the pain reach her face. Her ankle was wrong, not broken, he thought. The trap had caught just above the bone, and the moccasin had given her some protection, but badly torn, and it was already swelling into the leather. "You can't walk on that," he said. She understood that much, or she understood what she saw. She tried a step anyway, and the ankle buckled. He caught her again. This time she didn't pull away immediately. "My cabin's a 1.5 miles down the slope," he said. "There's nobody else out here. I can carry you, or you can stay, but if you stay, whoever set that trap is going to come back to check it." He looked at the north timber where he'd seen the fire ring and the horses. Maybe today he saw her weigh it. Her eyes went to the north timber and came back to him. She said something in Chiricahua Apache, a short phrase, sharp-edged, that he didn't understand. Then she held out her arm. He took it, and they went down the slope together. His cabin was simple but solid. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, a rope bed with a straw tick, a plank table, and 2 chairs. He got her inside and onto the chair nearest the fire and went out to unsaddle and stable his horse. By the time he came back in, she had unwrapped her moccasin herself and was examining her ankle with both hands, pressing along the bone line with her fingers, the way someone does when they know what they're checking for. She looked up at him and made a pronouncement in Apache. Whatever it meant, it wasn't asking for his opinion. He got water boiling and found his store of clean cloth. He kept a tin of comfrey salve he'd gotten from a Tohono O'odham woman near Tucson. Previous winter, the kind made from the plant itself, not the watered-down territorial medicine chest variety. He set it on the table near her and sat down across from her and watched her, and she watched him, and neither of them spoke. She cleaned and wrapped the ankle herself. She did it methodically, without hurry, with the competence of someone who'd done this kind of thing before. When she reached for the comfrey tin and smelled it, something in her expression shifted, not approval, exactly, but recognition. She used it. Then she leaned back in the chair and looked at him with something that was not gratitude and not hostility, but a kind of careful attention, as though she was making a decision about what category he belonged in. She said one word. He didn't know it. He touched his chest and said, "Eli." She watched that. Then she touched her own chest and said, "Doli." He repeated it back to her. She gave him the smallest nod. That was the beginning. She slept in the chair that first night, the knife from her belt in her hand. He didn't say anything about it. He banked the fire and went to the back room and lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what came next. In the morning he got up early and put coffee on and cut the dried venison into strips the way he always did for morning. And he set her portion on the table without ceremony and sat down with his own. She ate. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to, but she ate. And when the coffee was poured, she took the cup with both hands and held it near her face and let the steam reach her before she drank. Eli thought about the fire ring in the north timber. He thought about those heavy traps, too big for deer, the kind that held by weight and pain, the kind men set when what they wanted to catch didn't need to be in one piece when they came to collect. He'd heard about the bounty trade. Arizona Territory in 1883 was not a safe place to be Apache, and the Chiricahua in particular had been driven and hunted and confined until what was left of them moved in small bands through the mountain country, staying low, staying quiet. He asked her, carefully, trying words and then his hands. Was she far from her people? She understood what he was asking. She held up 2 fingers and then pointed north and made a walking motion. 2 days' walk, he guessed. Her band was 2 days north, not far enough with bounty riders in the timber. He told her he would ride north that morning and look at the camps. She shook her head sharply. A no that meant something stronger than disagreement. She said several things in Apache, looking at him steadily. And he got the sense she was telling him she had not survived this long by letting strangers make decisions for her. He stayed. Over the next few days, a kind of irregular rhythm settled into the cabin. The ankle needed rest, and she gave it rest mostly, but she was not idle. She found the torn harness leather stacked near the door and started mending it, using a bone awl she had in her blanket roll and a spare length of sinew. She did it with such practiced speed that he watched her work for 10 minutes without realizing he was staring. She looked up and caught him at it, and he looked away. There was a problem of food. He had provisions enough for himself through the winter. Dried venison, beans, flour, some salt and lard, but a second person was a second mouth, and he hadn't planned for it. He didn't raise this as a problem. He just portioned things smaller and said nothing. And on the third day she looked at what was left in the bean sack, and looked at him and said something he didn't understand, and then went out through the door before he could stop her. She came back an hour later with her blanket skirt held out in front of her like an apron full of something. Piñon nuts, dried late-season berries he couldn't name, and a bundle of something green and leafy. She spread it out on the table and sorted it with practiced hands. He recognized the piñon nuts, the rest he wasn't sure of. She held up the green bundle and pointed to the fireplace and made a steeping motion with her hands. Tea. She'd gone foraging on one ankle in the cold pine scrub and come back with enough food for 3 days, and a medicinal plant she wanted boiled. He built up the fire. That evening they sat across from each other at the plank table, tea between them and a pot of beans that smelled better than anything he'd cooked in 6 months. She'd added something to them, a dried herb from her pack, something that cut the flatness out and gave it a depth he couldn't have gotten on his own. He tried to ask what it was. She said the word in Apache, and then, thinking about it, looked around the cabin and picked up a dried sprig of something from her bundle and held it out for him to smell. He smelled it. He had no idea what it was called, but it smelled like the high mountain country after rain. She said the word again, watching his face, and for some reason that struck him as almost funny, the specificity of it, the patience of it, the way she was teaching him her world, one smell at a time. He made the sound as best he could, and she didn't laugh exactly, but something in her expression loosened. That was the first time the quiet between them didn't feel like a wall. She knew medicinal plants the way some people know a language, not by thinking about it but by recognition, the way you know a word the moment you see it. The green bundle she'd boiled into tea was for the ankle, she indicated. She made a poultice of one thing and bound it fresh each morning, and by the end of the first week, the swelling had dropped by half. He'd seen frontier doctors do worse. He told her what he could manage in sign and simple words, that his brother Thomas was dead, that this land was his, that he didn't mean to keep her from her people, but the timber to the north was still being watched. She got the gist of it. She told him things in return, not stories exactly, more a kind of reporting. Her band, the family she'd come from, the foraging run that had taken her this far south and into the trap. She'd gone looking for a particular plant, a root the band needed for a winter preparation, and she'd ranged farther than she'd meant to. That was how she'd come to be in his pine draws. He learned the Chiricahua word for pine. He learned the word for cold. He learned the words she used for her family, which was not a single word, but a phrase that seemed to mean something closer to, "those who share fire with me." She was wary. She was not warm, but she stopped sleeping with the knife in her hand somewhere around the 5th night. And he noticed, and said nothing about it. By the end of the first week, a particular comfort had settled in around the edges of the days. It was not ease exactly. Too much was still uncertain for that, and she was still a guest who might leave on any morning. But there was a rhythm to it. The way shared routine creates a rhythm even between strangers. He learned that she did not like the coffee sweet. She took it with a pinch of salt instead, the way her people sometimes prepared certain bitter things, and he made it that way without comment. She learned that he had a habit of checking the window latch before he slept, something he'd done since childhood, and she stopped reading it as suspicion after the 3rd night. She was making a basket. He'd noticed her working with materials she'd gathered outside, lengths of willow from the creek draw, stripped and soaked soft in a pot of water she'd commandeered on the hearth. She worked it in the evenings, in the chair by the fire, her fingers moving through the weave with the kind of memory knowledge that doesn't need attention. Chiricahua basket work, he learned later, was its own language. Certain patterns carried specific meaning. Particular weaves were family-specific. He didn't know this then. He just watched her hands moving and thought that he had never seen anything made with such precision from materials that would have been invisible to him on the same ground. One evening she held the half-finished basket out to him. He took it and turned it over and ran his thumb along the tight spiral of the coiled base. "Good," he said, which was inadequate. She made a sound that was not quite a word but conveyed clearly that she was aware of this. He looked at her. "What's the word, in your language, for something made well?" She said it. He repeated it badly. She corrected him. He repeated it worse. Something crossed her face. Not patience exactly, more the expression of someone who has decided the effort is worth the frustration. She said it slower, breaking it into its 2 syllables the way you break a thing apart to show how it goes together. He got it closer. She handed the basket back and went back to her weaving. He kept the word in his head. He said it to himself at intervals for the rest of the evening, the way you keep a new thing from slipping away. He asked her about Usen. He'd heard the word, understood it roughly, wanted to know. She looked at him for a long moment, the way you look at someone who's asked a serious question and you're deciding whether to answer it. Then she talked for a while, more at length than she'd spoken to him about anything, and from her hands and her face and the few words that crossed over, life, sky, the way she touched the ground when she said it, he understood that Usen was not like the god he'd been raised with, not a figure in a cloud, but something more like the sustaining force that ran through everything, the reason the spring ran and the deer came back and the pine held on through snow. He didn't say anything about this. He just listened, and when she was done, the silence had a different quality to it. He showed her the map he kept of his trap sets, pointed out where each one was, why, how he checked them. She looked at it for a long time. Her finger traced the lines on the paper, and he realized she was not just reading his map but checking it against something she held in her own head, her own knowledge of this terrain, laid out differently but just as complete. She pointed to an area northeast of his line, past his fence into the steeper timber, and said something, and then looked at him with an expression that was clearly a question. "That's above my property," he said. She made a gesture that meant something like. And yet, he rode up there the next morning and found 2 more of the heavy traps, these ones set close to a deer run that ran through a fold in the hill. He pulled them out and added them to the pile. He thought about the men who'd set them, who they were, where they camped. He didn't have to wait long to find out. It came on the 12th day. There were 3 of them. He saw them from the upper pasture in the afternoon while he was mending fence. 2 on horseback with a 3rd pack animal behind, moving along the tree line to the north. Something about the way they moved, unhurried, scanning, told him they were looking for something specific. He got back to the cabin. Doli was at the table, working the harness leather again. She looked at his face when he came through the door and put down the awl. He told her what he'd seen. She already knew. She'd heard the horses before he had, from inside the cabin, and her pack was rolled up and close to hand. "They'll come down to the cabin," he said. "They'll have seen the smoke." She looked at him without expression. Her hands were still. He thought about it for a moment. "You need to go to the back room," he said, "and stay there." She shook her head. It was the same firm no as before. But this time it came with something else. She stood up, and he saw that she had an ash bough in her pack, short and recurved, strung. She hadn't shown it to him before. She held it with a quietness that told him it was not the first time she'd made a decision like this one. "This isn't your fight," he said. She looked at him with something that came close to contempt. "My ankle," she said, in careful English that he hadn't known she had, and then, "my trap." He stared at her. She sat back down. "I will be here," she said. He didn't argue. The three men came down out of the timber about an hour before sundown. They were rough-looking men, trail-hardened, the kind who drifted through the territories, doing work that didn't have a polite name. The one in front had a beard that hadn't been touched in a month, and eyes that moved in a flat, professional way across everything he looked at. Eli met them in the yard, rifle in hand, easy but present. The leadmen said they were trap arbors, working permits in the upper timber, and they'd had some of their sets interfered with and were looking into it. Eli said he didn't know anything about their sets. The lead man looked at the cabin and looked at Eli. He said they'd also heard there was a rogue Apache woman moving through this country, one who'd gotten away from a legal collection party, and if Eli had seen anything like that, he ought to let them know because there was a federal warrant and a cash bounty for her return. Eli said he hadn't seen anything like that. The lead man said he'd like to have a look inside the cabin. Eli said no. There was a silence. The lead man looked at his two companions. He looked at Eli's rifle. He looked at the tree line and then at the door of the cabin. An arrow came out of the shadows of the doorway and hit the lead man's horse in the knee. Headstall, close enough to shave leather from the cheek piece. The horse threw its head. The lead man grabbed leather and spent the next 5 seconds staying on. By the time he had his horse under control, he was looking at Eli's rifle barrel, which had not moved, and at the doorway of the cabin, where Doli stood with the second arrow already knocked. She stood in the doorway with her bad ankle and her short bow, and she looked at the three men, with the calm attention of someone who has already made every relevant decision. The lead man looked at her. He looked at the arrow. He looked at Eli. He said some things that Eli didn't bother listening to closely. Then he pulled his horse around, and the three of them went back up toward the timber. Eli watched them go until they were out of sight. He turned around. Doli had lowered the bow. She was leaning against the doorframe, taking the weight off the ankle she'd been standing on for the better part of 10 minutes without showing a thing. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were on the tree line. "That was a good shot," he said. She looked at him. Then with great care she said in English, "I know." She went inside and sat down and put her foot up on a chair, and he stood in the dooryard for a moment, looking at where three men had just decided. This stretch of country wasn't worth the trouble. He didn't think they'd come back. Men like that operated on calculation. The cabin had a resident rifle, and now a demonstrated Apache presence, and the math had changed. But he wasn't going to bet her life on it. He came inside and sat down across from her, and she looked at him without speaking. "Waiting," he said. "How long until you can walk 2 days north?" She thought about this honestly. 7 days, she said. "Maybe 8. He nodded. "Then you stay until it's ready." She studied him. Something moved across her face that he couldn't quite read. Then she said, in Apache, something short that he thought might have been an agreement, or a thank you, or both. Those next 8 days were the quietest and the fullest he'd had in 4 years. He understood that what he felt had shifted somewhere in the past 2 weeks, and he didn't try to name it or do anything with it. He just let it be what it was and attended to the days as they came. He mended fence in the mornings, and she watched from the top rail when the ankle allowed it, and he showed her how the Arizona Territory had required every fenceman to think about wind and frost heave, and the particular obstinacy of pine posts in rocky soil. She showed him how to identify 3 different plants in the draws that he'd walked past 100 times without seeing, one for fever, one for pain, one for a wound that wouldn't close. He wrote the names down phonetically in the back of his account book, She taught him to say, "Share fire with me" in Chiricahua Apache. He practiced it until she stopped correcting him. On the 10th day, he found a bird's nest, fallen from a pine in the wind, still intact, a small tight construction of grass and horsehair and some fiber he didn't recognize. He brought it in and set it on the table because it seemed like the kind of thing that should be looked at rather than left. Doli picked it up and examined it the way she examined everything, with complete attention. She traced the inner cup with one finger and said something in Apache that he didn't catch. He waited. She set it down. "My mother made nests," she said. "Not birds' nests, the other kind." He wasn't sure what she meant. She gestured around the cabin, at the fire, the table, the way the space was arranged. "A place where things stay safe," she said. He looked at the cabin through her eyes for a moment. It was a working space, not a home, functional but empty of the things that made somewhere feel inhabited. No pictures, no cloth on the table, no small accumulated objects, just the tools a man needed to keep alive. He realized, sitting there with her, that he had been treating this place like a temporary arrangement even after 4 years in it. As though he'd never quite decided to be here. He told her about Thomas, the whole of it, the borrowed money and the cattle fever and the Tuesday morning in the Cochise County hardpan. She listened without interrupting, and when he was done, she didn't offer him comfort, which was correct. She just sat with the weight of it for a moment, the way you sit with something that belongs to someone else, acknowledging it rather than trying to lift it. Then she told him about her mother, who had been a healer, a woman of standing in the band, the keeper of certain plant knowledge that not everyone was trusted with. Doli had learned at her side from the time she was old enough to walk into the hills. Her mother was 3 years dead of the fever that had swept through the Chiricahua camps in the spring of '80, and Doli still spoke of her the way you speak of something that remains present even in its absence. Her band had survived by moving, by knowing the country, by keeping knowledge alive the way a fire is kept alive, passed carefully from hand to hand, never let go entirely. She was not just a healer's daughter, she was a healer. The root she'd been searching for when she found the trap was the same one her mother had shown her, growing in the high draws on the south side of a particular rock formation 3 miles above Eli's property line. The band needed it for a winter preparation her mother had made, and Doli was the only one who still remembered exactly where it grew. "She would know the name for you," Doli said, in her careful English, one evening while the fire was low. He asked what she meant. She thought about it. "In my people there are words for the kind of person someone is, not their name. The other thing." She looked at the fire. "My mother was good at knowing which word fit. What word would she use?" Doli was quiet for a moment. Then she said a word in Apache that he didn't know. He asked what it meant. She looked at him directly. "The man who opens the trap," she said. He didn't say anything. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in a long rush and then settled. On the morning of the 8th day, she put weight on the ankle and walked the length of the cabin and turned and walked back. Still tender, he could see it in the set of her jaw, but holding. She rolled her pack and checked the bow. He had her pack horse ready. He'd taken one of his own horses. An easy-gaited roan that wouldn't trouble a rider favoring one leg. He'd provisioned it with enough dried meat and corn and salt to carry her through the 2-day travel north comfortably. She stood in the yard in the early light and looked at what he'd done. She looked at the horse. She looked at him. He said, "You'll come to the timber ridge, drop down into the canyon country on the north side, and your people will be somewhere in that country." He'd looked at the map. He'd done the best he could with the information they'd traded over 12 days. "I know where my people are," she said. "Right." She had her pack on the horse. She had her foot in the stirrup. Then she stopped. She reached into her blanket roll and brought out something small, a flat piece of worked leather no bigger than his palm, stitched with a fine geometric pattern in blue and red thread, the kind of work that took a long time. He didn't know when she'd made it. Sometime in the evenings, he supposed, when he'd been outside. She held it out to him. He took it. He turned it over in his hands. He looked up at her. "Doli." She was already looking at him, he said, with the care of a man who has thought something through very thoroughly and decided to say it anyway. "When the ankle is fully healed, when you've been back to your people, if you wanted to come back here, you'd be welcome. For as long as you wanted." He felt the inadequacy of English for what he was trying to say. He said, This place doesn't have to be as quiet as it's been. She held his gaze for a long moment, long enough that he could hear the pines moving and the roan horse shifting his weight and the particular silence of a morning that is waiting for something, she said. In Chiricahua Apache, the phrase he'd been practicing. Share fire with me. He got it right. She nodded. Something in her eyes that wasn't quite a smile, but was something in the same country as a smile. Then she turned the roan north and rode for the timber. He watched her until she was gone into the pines. He stood in the yard for a long time after that, the worked leather piece in his hand, the morning light coming sideways through the trees, the cold air sharp in his lungs. The cabin behind him felt different than it had that morning, though nothing in it had changed. 42 days later, she came back. She came out of the north timber in the gray afternoon on the same roan horse, riding with someone, an older woman, small and sharp-eyed, who looked at Eli from 100 yards away with the frank assessment of someone who has been briefed and is now fact-checking. Doli's aunt, it turned out. Or the closest English word for what the relationship was, one of the women of standing in the band, there to look at the man her niece had come back to and decide what she thought of him. He stood in the yard and he let himself be looked at. The older woman spoke to Doli in rapid Apache. Doli answered. The older woman spoke again, one eyebrow going up slightly. Doli answered again with what sounded like patience. The older woman looked at Eli. She said something directly to him in Apache, 3 words, very clearly enunciated. He looked at Doli. She wants to know if you understand, Doli said. I don't. She said, be careful with her. He looked back at the older woman, and he nodded once, slowly the way you nod when you're making a promise and you know it. The older woman held his gaze for another moment, and then seemed to arrive at something. She spoke again to Doli, shorter this time, and then turned her horse and rode back toward the timber. Doli watched her go. Then she turned back to him. She will come again in the spring, she said, to see if you were telling the truth. Then I'd better be. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him from the ground beside the iron trap, measuring, reading, deciding what category he belonged in. But it was a different measurement now. There was something else in it. She dismounted. He reached out his hand. After a moment she took it, just her fingers in his, simple and clean, standing in the yard in the cold November light with the pine smell coming off the Chiricahuas and the horses breathing steam. He said, you know I don't have a word for what to call this, she considered. I do, she said, and she said it in Apache. The same word she'd told him her mother would have found for him. He asked what it meant again. Different from what I thought, she said. He held her hand, and the light moved through the pines, and the cold was nothing, just the ordinary cold of a country that asked something of you, and sometimes, if you were lucky and careful and willing, gave you something back. Some things in this world are beyond what either fear or loneliness can keep from happening. 2 people from different worlds, shaped by different losses, held together at first by nothing more than an iron trap and a choice to pry it open. And then slowly, by the kind of trust that grows only in the quiet places, the way certain plants grow only in the high cold country where not everything can survive. Eli Brandt had come to the Chiricahua foothills looking for silence. He found something better. Doli had gone into the pine draws looking for a root her people needed. She found something she hadn't known she was missing. Neither of them would have chosen the path that brought them there. But that is the nature of the traps we don't see coming. Sometimes the most important thing is who reaches down to open them, and who stays.